Hi, and welcome back to our first session. This is our first Parley of the Festival of Place. And what is a Parley is always the first question everyone asks me. It is a live roundtable discussion for 30 minutes, and then it transforms into an audience question time for the second 30 minutes. And during that period of time, we're going to ask you to either raise your hand if you want to join the stage and ask your question or comment in person. You'll see a hand below my face. Pardon me, I'm going to drink a bit of tea. You'll see a hand below me. You can use that to raise your hand and indicate that you would like to turn on your microphone and camera and join us on stage. Or you can post a question in the Q&A, which is located in your control panel. You'll see a little speech bubble that says questions. You select this session, which is Parley, Future of Planning, and then you can put your questions to us. So there are no presentations from our Parleys, as we call them, but they're going to have a vibrant discussion, and then I will indicate to you when it's time for us to shift to the second part, which is our questions. For this session, we have a provocation video, which is being shared on Twitter. If you search for hashtag Festival of Place by Shit Planning, who is exploring some of the issues as we see them about planning. And of course, they're anonymous, so they're not able to speak on their behalf, but they make some really strong arguments. So do check that out. We're going to share the link for that in the chat. The Festival of Place is a safe space to ask questions and share professional challenges, and we need your help to create this vibe. So do help us to share in the chat. Be generous with your time, and please keep your comments and questions to 60 seconds. We're going to cut you off at 2 minutes so that we get as many people involved as possible. And actually, our panel at that point is going to try to answer as succinctly as they can too. We're going to keep them under 2 minutes for the second half as well. So the ambition of this Parley is a frank exploration of challenges and blockers with a view to developing a shared direction of travel when it comes to the future of planning. And so what I'm going to do now is introduce our amazing panel. I'm really, really pleased this morning to be joined by Jonny Anstead, Founding Director of Town, Finn Williams, CEO of Public Practice, Pam Alexander, Non-Executive of London Legacy Development Corporation, and Andy von Bradsky, Head of Architecture at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So I think we're just going to bring you guys to the fore a little bit and share the screen. And then we're going to kick off with the two really founding and central questions that we look at in the Parley, which is about the kind of professional challenges that each of you are seeing and the kind of blockers as you see them and how we can move towards change. So without further ado, can I ask you to go first, Andy? Would you be able to kind of tell us a bit about what you do and what you see as the challenges right now when it comes to planning?
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. First time I've participated in something called a Parley. I had to look it up and understand it. But looking forward to the debate. My name's Andy von Bradsky, as introduced. I am the Head of Architecture in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. My background is obviously in private practice, where I spent a good 35 years working in the housing industry in all its guises. Now advising on design-related matters in the ministry. And that is a significant step forward for government to appoint somebody like me and to have a team which sits within government that looks at design-related matters. Currently, my main task is in supporting the design coding work. We produced a national design guide last year, which had a placeholder for a national model design code as currently stated. And we are working on that particular piece of guidance at the moment. Guidance really for the current planning system. Obviously the subject of this discussion is about planning, perhaps planning reform, planning for the future. Obviously the white paper that came out gives lots of interesting observations about how planning might move in the future. Three key planks, really, about certainty for developers, certainty for communities, speed, so it could speed up delivery, but fundamentally, and from my perspective, very relevant to this discussion about quality and how do we underpin quality in the system. We need to have more quality schemes rather than the exceptions. So how do we drive up quality as a consistent standard within planning system? And how do we achieve that through a better engagement with communities? So discussion about communities will no doubt come up. Fundamentally, design codes are seen as a mechanism for improving the quality. I see that as the major step forward for me and my work at the moment. So look forward to a discussion about the role of design codes in driving up standards. Is that enough for me to introduce?
Yeah, I hear a challenge in there, which is how do we drive up quality and design? And so, Jonny, can I bring you in now to discuss what you see as professional challenges when it comes to planning?
Yeah, sure. Hi, hello everybody. Do you want a quick intro as well? I'm Jonny Anstead, one of the founders of Town. We're a development company. We focus mainly on residential and residential-led property developments. We're not really developers in the sense of kind of having intended to be developers. I'm a linguist by background and then became involved in the built environment and have kind of ended up this way. So I like to think that we see things a little bit differently from much of the real estate sector in the way that we approach our work. Our first completed project is called Marmalade Lane. It's in Cambridge. It's a co-housing community of 42 homes. And it was a real learning experience about how developers can learn with the people who are going to be living in a place about what makes for the best kind of design solutions and outcomes. And I suppose that that leads me on to kind of some of the principal challenges and some kind of thoughts about how we tackle them, which was that when you actually talk to real people who are going to be living in a place, they don't really want most of the things that I think it's imagined that they might want. So things like fitted kitchens and it kind of be with, high-end appliances, which you see in estate agents' adverts everywhere, being the kind of principal driver, aren't actually all that relevant when you talk to real people. En suites often aren't so mandatory as an estate agent might tell you, because people actually want space that they can use in a different way, potentially from having an ensuite. They might want a larger, flexible lounge that they can also have a work corner in. And there are lots of other things too. So, for example, you might be told that you must have 2 car parking spaces per dwelling. Real people might actually prefer lots of other alternatives to being bound to use their car all the time. So they might want to have decent cycle clubs and shared car schemes and all those sorts of things. But it was only through having the conversation with end users that we were able to articulate what that group wanted and sort of secure those outcomes for planners. And it just really strikes me that these things are it was a kind of unusual project that meant that those really great outcomes where we were really able to secure the things that people wanted came about. And in a normal situation, the default would have been very, very different. It would have been lots of car parking, lots of private space, very little shared space. And I think a big challenge is how we sort of take some of those things that are kind of clearly, favoured and welcomed by many and make them more like the kind of what should be the default rather than the exceptions to the norm.
Great, thank you very much. I want everybody to know that I'm now going to go to Finn, not because I'm doing all the men first, but Pam actually asked to go last, so I would have brought her in early. So just to ward off any assumptions there, but I am going to you next, Finn, because I'm going to let Pam go.
Thank you, Christine, and great to be here, so to speak. So I'm Finn Williams. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Public Practice, which is a not-for-profit social enterprise that's building the public sector's capacity for proactive planning. So we're really learning about how the public sector is responding to the proposals in the white paper, wider planning reform, through our network of approaching 150 associates by Christmas, who are really on the front line of improving quality, delivering many of the actually ambitions of the white paper in practice in authorities across London, the wider southeast and east of England. And I think for me, that's the starting point is, the white paper itself, by the images of the many schemes within it, shows that it is possible to deliver good outcomes through the current planning system. those exemplars are peppered throughout the publication. The question is how to make, I think, good places the default, as Jonny said, rather than the exception. And it's not like we have policies at the minute that say make crap places do shit planning. We've got a solid framework through the NPPF. In our experience, it's actually the people more than the policies that make the biggest difference to what's actually delivered on the ground. So from my experience working at Croydon Council, the GLA, good planners can work around an imperfect planning system, but a perfect planning system can't work around a lack of good planners. And I think what is exciting about the white paper is that it really has the potential to create better outcomes, not necessarily through the legislative change it will bring about, but actually through the potential change in the role of the planner, of the built environment expert within local government, of local authorities overall in their role in shaping the future of the built environment. So I think that's actually really exciting and a big opportunity. But what goes along with that are some challenges. Of course, the challenges around resourcing, and that's issue around funding. But also a kind of deeper question, which is who is the planning system for? And I'd be really interested in hearing everyone's thoughts on this. The white paper says the planning system should be paid for by the people, the principal beneficiaries of planning gain of the system, which it lists as landowners and developers. But for me, and for public practice, the planning system isn't there just to benefit developers and landowners. The planning system, the scope of really good planning goes beyond managing growth. It's also about creating the conditions for social, economic, environmental sustainability. It's the kind of proactive stuff around drawing up local lists, supporting town centres, economies, improving public realm, enabling community-led initiatives, developing climate emergency action plans. That's the stuff our associates are doing. And frankly, I think it's unrealistic and unfair to expect developers to cross-subsidise all of those costs. So for me, the real challenge is how can we broaden the agency of public planning, use this as an opportunity to redesign the job description of the public planner so that it encompasses all of those proactive elements of design. And fundamental to that is, well, how much money have we got to fund those kind of posts within local government? Who ends up taking those roles? And how broad a remit do we allow them to have over the way our places develop?
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Pam, over to you.
Thanks very much. And it's really exciting to be here. I'm looking forward to this fortnight, Christine. Thank you. I wanted to go last because one of my professional challenges is that I'm a non-exec now, which means I'm on a number of different boards and wear a number of different hats. And I wanted to select a hat that might work with what the others had said. I chair Commonplace, which is a digital engagement company. I'm also, as Christine said, a non-exec on the board of the London Legacy Development Corporation, where I chair the planning committee. And that's been an interesting challenge online, but it's got many more people engaged, which I'm really pleased about, watching us online, rather than the very few that occasionally turn up when we were meeting in person. And I'm also on the board of the Connected Places Catapult. So two of the themes that run through the white paper, the importance of digital planning and the move towards a focus on community engagement, which I'll come back to, are absolutely critical to the things I'm thinking about at the moment. But let's be honest, the professional challenges for all of us are planning in a time of huge change and challenge, both from COVID and from Brexit, and the consequences that they're going to bring. So whilst at the LLDC we've faced obviously a delay in construction, but got that back underway again, we're also seeing some challenges for viability, which will make it much more difficult to take the planning gain and turn it into infrastructure for the community, affordable housing. And that, I'm afraid, is going to get worse rather than better over the short term at least. For me, the biggest challenge and the most important thing for the white paper to focus on as it goes into detail, because speaking as an ex-civil servant, it's quite green for a white paper, and the devil will be in the detail, is the total lack of trust in the planning system at the moment. And that's trust from people, who don't believe that what we're going to do is going to make their lives better. But it's also trust from the government that any of us know how to plan properly. It's trust from the developers that if they spend 2 years putting a development together in coordination with the local planners, the council or the local planning committee will actually agree with the priorities they've spent 2 years working on. And I know from some of the issues that we've had in the planning committee I sit on, how difficult it is for officers always to anticipate what people are feeling from the conversations they are having, as Jonny said, with real people on the ground who have real priorities which change. And so the system needs to be sufficiently adaptable on the ground to change. And what I've been excited by over the last period is we were very fortunate at Commonplace to get a major investment just before lockdown. So we've been greatly increasing our work, and we've done quite a lot of work for free on COVID response for local authorities. And there really is an enormous appetite for good community engagement, not just the people who will turn up at the town hall or respond to a piece of plastic on a lamppost, but real online digital engagement, which engages many more people and a greater variety of people, and particularly many more young people. 70% of the 2 million people who've responded to Commonplaces have been under 45, and they are the future for Place. So we're very excited by that, but we're very keen that the move to digital throughout the planning system, which will make it faster, will make it more predictable, will make it a lot less onerous for every single party, need to be done in a way that is standardized, that ensures that it's interoperable, that the evidence base that's so critical to actually believing that the planning system is going to do good is accessible to everybody, which means it's not 1,000 different systems across the country. And I think that's one of the challenges which the Catapults laid out a pretty good manifesto for, how to create an interoperable, map-based, modular system that will be of huge benefit from everyone, from neighbourhood forums to developers to local planners and their committees.
I'm going to shoot in a different order this time. So, Jonny, I'm going to ping to you, and I want you to kind of you can pick up on some of the things other people have said, but also it'd be really good to hear, what is it that you need to get the better outcome that you want, or what do you think we need to get the better outcome?
Sure. Yeah, I suppose that just listening to everybody talking about the planning, about the planning system, I guess I kind of want to challenge the idea that there actually is a planning system in the way that everybody understands it. I think that as Pam was saying, trust is super low. Lots of people believe the planning to be corrupt and for profit. If you talk to a local authority planning officer, they're 99.9% of times the opposite of profitable and corrupt. They're decent people trying their best in difficult circumstances to achieve good outcomes. And it's not surprising when they move to the private sector, because who wouldn't sort of fancy an easier life sometimes? But so it seems to me that the idea that there is this thing called the planning system isn't quite right, because actually it's a system within a much more complex, wider system. And actually what people have mistrust in isn't the laws of planning or the process of planning, which is the only thing we ever really do anything about. It's actually the fundaments of how all of these conflicting, sometimes, interests are put together. So on one hand, you have you do have a civil kind of element to that, which is about laws and capacity. And Finn will be able to talk much better than me about the capacity within that system. But outside of that bit of the system, you have a whole kind of private sector culture and set of capacities, which are wholly different. And it seems to me that you can't talk about the planning system without also talking about the role of the private sector's culture within that system. And actually all we ever do is look at different ways of regulating a little bit of this overall system without really looking at the kind of whole cultural problem that we have within the private part of that. And I think the third dimension is that there's a political element to what people would understand to be the planning system, which of course is manifest at local levels through things like planning committees and committees that approve plan making processes. And that seems to me to warrant far more attention than it's getting at the moment, which is how we make that far more representative of a broad diversity of voices than it is today. So we know that the average age of elected local politicians is over 60 years old. We know that it's got terrible performance on all other metrics of representation. So how do we sort of actually reinvent dialogue at that local level, that political element of that dialogue, that actually brings better capacity, more representation, more commitment and expertise, and also a kind of longer term view? Because of course, local people who actually make decisions about planning situations are often thinking about the 2 to 3 year horizon, because that's the next time that they're going to get come up for election. So actually, it's not in their interest to make long-term, proper, strategic planning decisions around infrastructure and those other things, because actually it's much more convenient for them if they can find a way of securing their vote share locally by saying, be against, we're dead set against this planning application, or it's going to kind of congest our roads, or it's going to throttle our local services and hospitals. That's far more politically convenient for most people at that local level. So I think that we have to look much more culturally across the different components that make up what people might understand to be planning, and look at it much more broadly. And how we actually kind of rejuvenate all of those different parts of the puzzle, I'm not quite sure, but I'd be really interested to hear kind of what other people think, because I think it's long overdue that we look much more broadly than just at tinkering with the legislative elements of the.
Andy, I'm going to jump to you. I mean, we've heard about this engendered mistrust. The white paper itself, we've heard it's too green or maybe not baked enough. It is quite damning, the white paper, in its language. It's kind of saying that planning needs ripping up and starting again. Jonny's suggesting we don't want to tinker, but then also the fact that planning is quite political. And I know that there will be things you will and won't say, because planning is very political as well. So it'd be really good to hear you come back on some of those challenges, and how do we create a what does a fit for purpose system look like? What are we trying to get to, and what stops?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some real challenges in everything that everybody said, and it's not going to be easy. There were sort of tens of thousands of responses to the planning white paper that came in at the end of last week, and sifting through all of that's going to be quite a challenge. But there's clearly an awful lot of enthusiasm and mistrust about how government might go about this. The first thing to say is that for all the comments that are coming in, there is an awful lot to play for still in terms of how this moves forward. We acknowledge that there's an awful lot of detail that needs to sit behind the aspiration. I think it's a long overdue sort of discussion, though, about how you do speed things up, how you make it more efficient, how you help developers, but most importantly, I think, is how you help communities. And the discussion that we had earlier that Pam mentioned about, the role of communities in this is perhaps one of the greatest challenges, is how do you design a system that enables greater engagement at an earlier stage in the process? And there are lots of challenges around that. I mean, at the most, a few % of people get engaged in local planning. So in local plans. So how do you increase the number of people who do get engaged in what seems to be quite a sort of difficult time for people to, a difficult process, a difficult stage in the process for people to engage. So I think we need to think much more clearly about that, and much more sort of thought needs to be given to that process, bringing democracy forward, as they say. A sort of slight concern that the obsession over beauty as a word gets in the way of some of the debate. The debate is not about how things look. The debate is about how you create enduring places that last, that have a sort of an enduring sort of quality about them that can be seen into the future. And you have to look around at a lot of what developers produce at the moment, house builders, some accepted, of course, Jonny, who produce pretty mediocre product. So how do we sort of really change that? It's not just about the product, it's about the place and the kind of development that you need in a place. The other aspect, and the final point I make about this, is the point Jonny made about looking forward. So many local plans think about the here and now, and can only think about the here and now. how do we project forward some of those bigger challenges that are facing us in terms of demographic change, AI, mobility, an aging population, changes in the aspirations or the needs of younger people. You know, there's a whole raft of things that planning needs to be getting hold of. Our Home of 2030 competition, which is in now, was an attempt, I suppose, to actually define what are the issues for the future of home and the future of place. And I don't think we're anywhere near to answering that through the planning system at the moment. I have to say that's my own personal view, not necessarily one of government. So please don't tweet.
Thanks for sharing that. I would like to propose, we're going to shift in about 4 minutes, but I'm going to bring you guys in. We're going to shift to question mode, but I already have a question, which is, you know, we talk about planning being about creating places, and we do, but also isn't planning about poverty and public health and climate change? And it's about, you know, we're talking about giving it to the people, but also this is a professional sector. We're talking about sewage. We're talking about air quality, access to decent education, GP practices. So I think there is a danger to focusing on this kind of placemaking, which of course this is the Festival of Place, but of course the foundations of planning are in public health. So I don't want to go down too far down that without kind of just marking that in the sand, that we know populism and popular votes can be democratic, but they can also result in unfavorable outcomes for the poorest and the most disenfranchised. I'm going to ping over to Pam now. I know you want to come.
Thank you. And absolutely, all of those things are really important. I guess in answer to your question, what do we need? One of the things I was going to say is to that point, because what we have lost is strategic planning at the level below the nation and above the locality. London is fortunate enough to have a London plan, and we're the only region that does. And it does seem to me that that's where all of those issues can be brought into play at the proper cross-boundary way, because we're not going to achieve zero carbon local authority by local authority. We have to have a strategic plan for it. We're not going to deal with the exclusion and poverty challenges that have been so much to the fore at the moment if we just look at the boundaries of individual authorities. And so for me, the big problem is no strategic planning at that sub-regional level. But you'd expect me to say that because I used to run a regional development agency and have a spatial plan and a housing plan and an economic plan. I wanted, if I may, to slightly also respond to that question by saying one of the big challenges I think we have at the moment is the lack of money for social infrastructure, by which I mean beyond the roads and the bridges that will have to come if you're going to build houses or offices or retail. The social infrastructure of affordable housing, which should be mixed with the owner-occupied housing, not separated from it. And some of the proposals at the moment scare me quite a lot on going backwards on that. But also there is a viability issue, and we can't expect developers to pay for all of it, whoever it was. Was it Jonny that said that, or Andy? We need to have clear strategic plans at government level and at regional level as well to know how those things are going to be delivered. But I think we do have some answers to the other questions that Jonny and Andy raised about how we ensure that the people on the ground feel engaged. And one of those ways, at LLDC, for example, we have a youth forum, and they're not just asked occasionally. They come to the board, they're involved in our strategic planning. We've also got a group of our respondents at Commonplace who are young and telling us where we should be going and what questions we should be asking. But in respect of the white paper, my big worry is that people will only engage, and we have engaged quite a lot of people in local plans, mainly in London, I have to say, but we are much more successful at it if we can engage them at a formative stage rather than going to them and asking them whether they like something or not. And if we can involve them at the very beginning, then they're more likely to come back and comment on proposals as they come forward. But they have to believe there's a feedback loop. They have to believe they're being heard. And that means it has to be end to end, not just on the local plan, Because if I can't comment on what's happening next door because it's got automatic permission, I'm really not going to get engaged in the local plan. So I think there is a real underpinning there that's needed for the very good directions that are being taken in terms of putting community engagement front and centre.
Finn, I'm going to turn to you, but before I do, I just want to tell the audience it's now your time to start putting your questions in the Q&A box and start thinking about if you want to raise your hand. The hands are below me next to the emojis because we're going to turn to you in a moment. If you want to join us on stage, you have to use the raise the hand. And if you want to just type in a question, put it in the question field. But Finn, while we're waiting for people to get involved, can you come back on some of the things that have been shared there? I think one of the things you might be able to, I would love to hear you comment on is about this idea about strategic planning and of course professional planning as opposed and its link to and then the other half of it would be around community engagement. But what do we need to get to a better place?
Yeah, and to start off with, just to go back to this point about, is the planning system really the problem? You know, it's easy to blame the planning system for many things that are, yes, outside its control. Like, for example, build out rate, whether we're actually delivering the millions of homes that are consented. In many ways, the reaction has been that we've blamed the planning system for things that haven't been its fault, and then used that as an excuse to strip it of powers, rather than empowering it with the very tools and powers that it needs to, for example, have an influence on capturing the uplift in land value for the public benefit, directly delivering affordable, good quality homes, really engaging communities longitudinally on a kind of place-based scale. Yes, investing in social infrastructure, but actually also looking after it, the kind of revenue side of things. None of those are necessarily within the core remit of the planning system, and none of them are directly addressed, I have to say, through the white paper. But yet that's where the expectation comes from the public, quite rightly. And that's where trust starts to fall down when the planning system isn't able to act on those things. It's the kind of classic Jobsworth thing. Well, that's outside my remit as a planning officer. I don't have any influence on that. And planners don't want to have to state that. They want to say, no, we can influence all of this. So I think that's what I mean by broadening the agency of the job description of the planners. So those well-meaning 99.9%, I'd say 100% of public planners out there are actually able to act on those intentions. I think this point about trust is really interesting. That stat is included, the Grosvenor stat, in the white paper, that only 7% of people trust their local authority to make the right decisions on strategic strategic decisions. And I think there are risks there, because what the white paper proposes, actually what the wider raft of planning reforms could introduce, is a system where there are loopholes and contradictions from day one. A brand new planning system that already creates exceptions around permitted development rights, a fast track for beauty, earned autonomy from listed building consents, national strategic infrastructure project development consent orders for large sites. These are all ways round a system that hasn't been established yet. And I'd argue, if we want to build trust, that system needs to be as comprehensive as possible, and everything needs to come through a democratically accountable system, rather than find loopholes and exceptions from day one. To go back to your question, Christine, about the kind of the professional role of the planner to complement the public and the citizen, I think there is something really important about someone thinking very long term, someone thinking at a very large scale, which frankly I don't think we can expect every member of the public to do in their spare time through community engagement events or online. And particularly if we want to properly represent those who are most time poor, who happen to be those who are often financially least stable. So that's a responsibility of the public planner. Now, I think that kind of really long-term perspective actually runs counter to a lot of the rhetoric around speed and project speed. So yes, we should be aiming for quality, we should be aiming for a kind of holistic approach to planning, but to be perfectly honest, I think speed is the enemy of some of those intentions. The paper talks about making places that stand the test of time. That takes time. There are no shortcuts to good placemaking, I think. And in some ways, the value of the public sector, and it's perhaps controversial to say it, but it is that it's slow. it takes about 5 or 7 years to make any decent place, whatever way around it you go, whether you have a zoning system, whether you have a current kind of negotiated system. And that's a healthy process because it creates room for political engagement, for democratic representation, for conversations with local communities, for good quality design to evolve, to understand a wider place. And I think we need to be careful about the push for speed because actually land is scarce. We need to deliver at scale, but if we're delivering at scale, the pressure on speed becomes less, and it means we can really make sure that we're making the right decisions for and using the land that we do have really wisely.
Land is scarce and climate change advances. We just don't have time. So the best answer is not to build if you want to talk about climate change. But of course, that is not really the question, the answer that we want to the question often. Pam, I'm going to ping over to you. There's actually a question directed at you because we're moving into question mode. So audience, please feel free to raise your hand if you're the kind of person who never does this thing. Do it because we want to hear from the kind of person who doesn't do this thing, or type your question into the question box. But our first question is directed at you, Pam, and it's from Catherine Max, and she says, you said that the most success in engaging in local plans has been in London, and can you expand on that?
Yes, what I actually said was that Commonplace has been most involved in local plans in London, and they've been very successful. But we've also worked on neighbourhood and town plans around the country. So, for example, we worked on Blackpool Town Centre's plan, and 7,000 people got involved in that conversation right from the beginning, talking about what they wanted, then seeing what was proposed, then feeding back on that. And it helped, I think, enormously for Blackpool to get the largest grant from the government's Towns Fund, which I think was £40 million. So it really pays, and I think it pays because trust is built on what happens. It's not built on what's planned. People will only engage in working a plan up if they think it's actually going to be what happens in the end. And therefore it has to have enough detail in it for them to know that what's going to happen is what they want to happen. And I did just want to pick you up, Christine. Planning's not just about building new developments. Planning's very much about reusing what we've got and reusing it for the very best. And if we can do more of that and think about how we reuse what we've got, whether as affordable workspace or homes where they're needed, or recycling all those out-of-town retail centres we don't dare go to anymore into something for the local community. That's what planning's about. It's not just about greenfield sites that we want developers to build houses on, but could they make them a little bit more beautiful, please? Sorry, Andy. But it really is about so much more than that. And I don't go to any planning committee that I chair where we don't talk about open spaces, access to private open space and public green space. Where are the children going to play? What is the degree of sustainability of the buildings that we're talking about, whether they're commercial or residential? Are they future-proofed? Will they be adaptable? And will they get us anywhere close to zero carbon? So I do feel we need to expand what planning's about way beyond, with all due respect, what the white paper talks about, which is building new houses.
I'm going to pick up another question here, and actually, I think it's worth pinging this one to you, Jonny. It's around the places that, do we need? Well, it is actually directed at the government, so Andy, you might have to pick up on this one as well. But the government should be committed to the UK being, or the government is committed to the UK being carbon neutral. So why can't the planning process insist on all new places being carbon neutral? And that's from James Milne, an architectural technologist and psychologist. So Jonny, would you welcome the kind of directive as a developer for all projects to be carbon neutral? And would you know how to do that?
I think I want to, yes, I mean, clearly, yes, that's, if you're going to rebuild a planning system in 2020 on the tipping point of the climate crisis, you'd make it your principal objective to solve the climate crisis through planning. And that trumps all questions of speed. It has to. I want to pick up on the substantiation of his question, of James's question here, which is around refusing things on the basis of car dependency, high energy use, and so on. I think the big missing thing for me is about infrastructure and transport, because if you zone land and say yes, no, maybe on on one field at a time, you're still going to be developing one field at a time, and that still requires the same amount of transport infrastructure. Now, without forward planning, and as others have said, without that kind of 30-year infrastructure plan, there won't be the cycle routes, the train lines, and the bus routes, and all those things. Those things will not exist. So you will get beautiful homes at 2.5 car parking spaces per unit, creating places which are still as monocultural and as poor as they were before. They might just look ever so slightly different, and they might actually be better carbon performing homes, but the impact will still be pretty much as bad, because you've still got this kind of vast amount of infrastructure that's being kind of built in an ad hoc way and in an unsustainable way. So I think that we should be looking at, I guess my question is, why aren't we doing more to really focus on putting infrastructure in place to actually allow development to come forward? And that would speed up development, because infrastructure will kind of point to the right locations to put it in, but automatically it will kind of create a vastly better form of development, because it will be supported in the right places by infrastructure. So why aren't we focusing more on that in the long term, rather than I guess questions of beauty and speed?
Andy, I'm going to ping it over to you. Speed is the enemy of planning, has come up. Finn's mentioned that. Jonny has referred to, planning involves long-term infrastructure, looking at these long games. Climate change involves immediate action with a long view attached to it. And I think it'd be worthwhile talking here about permitted development and about the ambition to have things fast and unplanned and deregulated. And I guess over to you.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Just on the environmental issue, I mean, it's clear government's really set up a sort of legal target that it has to meet for 2050, and how it achieves that is still being sort of, I suppose, not entirely clear. And I don't mind saying that. Whether the planning system is intended to sort of address all of that, or to what extent straightforward regulation, so everybody has to comply. And those two sort of tensions about what gets done locally and what gets done nationally as a legal requirement is sort of probably the bit that needs to be sorted out. My personal view, I have to stress, is that you should let local authorities do more in terms of setting ambition. I say that without sort of fear of retribution from my colleagues, because I think, it's clear that the environmental agenda is probably the most important agenda that we all face. And unless we get that right, and unless the planning system as revised actually addresses that, I'm not sure that it's sort of hit on the kernel of our current issues. Health and well-being, clearly a major issue in terms of COVID at the moment, but in the longer term, the environmental issue is much more sort of a major issue. In terms of the sort of permitted development, this comes up quite a lot. I think we've been quite successful in putting forward to government that alongside permitted development needs to be quality. So how do you bake in quality expectations into allowing a fast track or a permission which is quicker? And the victory of many for advocating for space standards in permitted development right for conversions, is probably a signal that government acknowledges the importance of baking in quality as part of a faster system. So how do we do that across the piece, I think, is probably going to be debated quite a lot. And Jonny's point about infrastructure coming forward together with development. Again, I have to say, in defence of government, it really is trying to do what it can in terms of programmes. So the SHIFT programme of investment is trying to address that, bringing forward social and physical infrastructure alongside housing. Whether that has a sort of big enough traction at the moment is to be seen. But if you look at the Oxcam corridor, for example, and the proposals for that, there's a lot of very encouraging sort of recognition by government of the importance of bringing big infrastructure programs into play to help support development. So, the East-West rail link and the development that goes alongside that currently being very carefully managed by government in terms of how that might move forward. I feel I'm in defence of government. That's my job. I have to advocate, but by no means do I see that we've got all the answers yet. And just one final point. I realise time. I mean, the work that Finn's doing on promoting the quality agenda, the placemaking agenda, raising that standard of local authorities' capability to deal with these issues is really to be applauded. And we just need more skills in local authorities. We need not just chief planners or heads of architecture, or we need just a more proactive planning system that shapes a future for an area and has architects and designers, urban designers, landscape architects in public service. And I think that's one plea I'd make. Thank you.
Well, I banned self-promotion on the Parleys, but I think you can appreciate each other's roles. So I'm going to let that go, Finn. But I'm going to pick up a couple of questions here, or comments. Sarah Jones Morris has talked about trust and accountability coming up repeatedly in the sessions held by the Association of Collaborative Design. Brian Quinn has talked about how this obsession with speed seems insane, and we don't need to apologize for the time it takes. It takes time as a necessary input that should not be discounted. And he also comments that he thinks the government should merge the MHCLG with the Department of Transport, bringing them together to makes more strategic decision making. I'm all for breaking down silos, so I'm very much up for that. And Catherine Max has commented
when I joined the civil service, it was one department and it had environment.
Yeah, that sounds like a good system. And then climate change is a more significant public health issue than COVID, Catherine Max has commented, and they are not distinct. And this is very true. And I really do want to emphasize we do stray into planning being about how things look, but it really is about public health. So there's a question here from Ashley Feldman for the panel. So perhaps raise your hand if you would like to pick this up first. The data used in the planning system is poor, and the system of brownfield land registers is unfit for purpose. If the government wants to create a data-driven planning system, it needs to improve. What would be the panel's recommendation here? So we've talked about wanting to put systems to kind of make it more digital, make planning more digital. Does somebody want to comment about the use of data? Pam's going in.
Sorry, Christine. I was just responding to someone who was being kind about my background. I think that we've got to work really hard at a database system which people can understand, and that means it needs to be interoperable across the piece. And at the moment, it's just lots of documents online. It's impossible to find anything, and it's one of the reasons why planning permissions and planning applications are so enormous. Ludicrous amounts of data without any clear understanding of whether that data tells you it meets the requirements or it exceeds the requirements or it doesn't. And I think that requires some leadership. I'm absolutely delighted that one of the people working inside MHCLG used to be in the Future Cities Catapult, because we did a lot of work on plan tech to set out what was needed, and we worked with the RTPI on some standards, interoperability standards, but it will need huge resource, and I'm not sure where that resource is going to come from. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. We have a dearth of resource in planners, and they will need new skills to take on board some of these things that we want them to do. But we also have a huge dearth of people who feel comfortable putting things into digital form and then using it. And that's something we really ought to be putting a lot of effort behind.
As I pass to you, Finn, I just want to raise a caveat about the use of algorithms, because we all know that it hasn't been going very well. And also, I think if anyone wants to catch up, we ran a recent bite-sized festival around how data can discriminate. It's really worth a watch. It's on our YouTube channel. If you are interested in how to, if you are looking to use digital systems, how to make them more equitable.
Yeah, thank you. And I think Pam was referring to Ewan Mills, who's now in MHELG, who says that PDFs are where data goes to die. And we have this system where you scroll through a major planning application and it can take you a few hundred entries before you find the bit of the document that you need relating to one application. Everyone knows that that's a mad system. But I think this question of the frustrating thing in some ways is the technology is out there. But the barrier is about how local authorities can actually just build and procure and develop systems that, yes, are interoperable, but they're actually accessible for officers within the council and the public. And a lot of that does come down to skills and capacity. I completely agree with Pam. I think the problem that we've seen through public practice, Connected Places Catapult support us, really help found public practice because they recognise that it's not just enough to have the technological solutions and to invite authorities to be part of them. You actually need those people in-house who can get under the bonnet of the algorithms, who can really access and use like GIS, even GIS data as a kind of proactive tool. And that needs in-house skills, but the first step is actually, yes, you need the funding for those skills, but you actually need to design a job description. And that's a real barrier at the minute, is that local authorities in many cases don't even know exactly how to define the job description of the kind of person who would come in and do those roles, let alone then advertise it and attract the right person in-house. And I think that's going to be a huge area of need for authorities and government to work on over the next couple of years, not just in relation to data and digital, plan tech, prop tech, whatever you want to call it, but also in relation to, yes, design and really meaningful community participation, engagement and co-design as well. There's a certain way that training can only go so far. There are brilliant practitioners out there who want to be doing this kind of work for the public good. But we actually need to work first at creating the right kind of roles to be able to get them in working within local government and keep them there. I think we've seen capacity buildings in the programs in the past for local authorities from government that have been very short-term timescales, and that's had the result that they've become very dependent on consultants and agency staff coming in to do those quick bits of work. But once the funding goes, so does the capacity. And actually, this is a huge opportunity over this kind of spending review period, the next 4 years, to really invest in in-house planning skills in their broadest sense, including data and digital and all the rest of them, so that in 4 years' time, at the end of that period, that expertise is there to stay.
I want to pick up first a question from Suleiman Al-Sadi, a really vital question, especially looking at our panel here as well. Part 1, architectural assistant at Stride to Glown. How do we remove the whitewashed reality of the planning system that fails to engage different groups of people it claims to represent? And this includes citizens from different socioeconomic backgrounds and crucially different ethnic backgrounds. I guess I'm going to put that quite challengingly to you, Andy, because I know the white paper doesn't really allow for much community consultation at this point. And I know, Pam, you're trying to reach out with digital technology. We know that's not an even playing field exactly yet. But Andy, how is the government going to listen to these communities? And can we expect a bit more diversity of background and socioethnic background to kind of how do we make more seats at the table and better seats and more inclusive seats?
Well, I can talk about this a bit because the work that we're doing on the design coding, the National Model Design Code, is requiring us to set out a model community engagement process. And that has required us obviously to think a bit more about what that means. How do communities engage with a design code early in the programme? And we've had workshops and we've discussed this with some experts. So we are coming up with a model approach to consultation. And if you look at the planning practice guidance, excuse me, which currently exists, which is design, process and tools, actually quite uniquely last year set out quite a lot of detail around what government thinks a good process for engagement should be. And we've talked a lot in this meeting about new forms of approaches to engaging, to reach out to different groups within communities. But I think it's really important that we don't just sort of assume that digital will address all these particular issues. I think it's a combination of making sure that local authorities have got the right people, for a start, who are able to enable that engagement. And some people can do it. Some architects are good at it. Some are, very pioneering in some aspects in terms of how you engage with communities. So how do we capture that? How do we spread that skill so that more people do that? It's not just about meetings in town halls or in community halls. It's about reaching out across a whole community to identify what those groups are. And community, there often isn't one community. There's often multiple groupings that form a community. So I think we have to be careful about the language that we use as well around this, that there are different smaller groups that need to be engaged. So it's a systemic issue, I think, about how you reach across different groups. I pick up on the point that Pam made much earlier about young people. It's a key, it's their future that we're trying to plan for here. So what are their views about their environment and how do we engage with them? So I think it's not just about socioeconomic groups or ethnic groups of different ethnic background. I think it's a quite systemic issue about how you do this in a coordinated way. And we talk a lot about the resources that are needed in local authorities for specific skills in terms of design or quality or digital. But I think there is also a skill set that's missing in local authorities about how to do this properly themselves and how to set up systems that enable that to happen effectively.
We have our first raised hand, so I'm going to invite James Milne to join us on the stage unless you lift your hand by accident, so hopefully you didn't. So you're going to receive an invite. We just have 3 minutes left in the session, so if you can keep your comment succinct.
Hi folks, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I was just going to pick up on those last 2 points really and say I think there's a real opportunity for planning departments, but also people in the private sector, architects firms and developers, really to go a little bit beyond the status quo and do things like employ people from a social sciences background and employ people with GIS skills, or there's free open source software called QGIS that anyone can download and use that's really good, that can give people an opportunity to start looking at these kind of data opportunities. And we have good data in the UK. We have the census that's all, again, freely available on government websites. It takes a bit of digging to work out how to do it, but it's not impossible. And when you do that as part of a design process, an evidence-based design process, you start to understand, hang on, this community has lots of people from a particular cultural background, or a particular demographic that's different to the national average. So we should actually be designing with those people specifically in mind on this specific project. And then I think you start to see those things come together, that data thing and that understanding of who you're designing for come together. And you can go and look for those people and do community engagement with that particular group. But I think it's
I got to help you there because I got to. Thank you very much for that. And actually, we just have 1 minute left in this session. So thanks for joining us on James and making those comments. Finn, I'm going to give you the last minute to tell us, you've got a diverse workforce at Public Practice. Can you take us into a more diverse and...
Yes, thank you. I would not normally speak on a panel of 5 white people like me. We thought there was going to be a more representative panel. It didn't work out in the end, but I think it's important to be here to make this kind of point. We've got to get to a point where it's not just the professions consulting with a representative group of the population, but where the profession is representative of the communities we serve. And that is a structural issue, and it's going to take a long time to address. And I think what's really shocking, a recent survey of local authorities in London revealed that 3/4 of councils that we work with on the GLA revealed that 3/4 of councils don't even have data on the ethnicity of their workforce, of their planning departments, or the ethnicity pay gap. Obviously, it's a bit better on gender, but still far off where it needs to be. And these are just the tangible, visible aspects of diversity that I think we rightly focused on, but there's so much more we need to do to address the less visible aspects like neurodiversity, disability, and fundamentally lived experience. And that's what we're trying to build into our recruitment process at Public Practice. We're always trying to improve it. We'll never say it's perfect, but we hope it's better than anything else really out there in the public sector. And it is making a difference. We now have about 25 to 30% of our associates are from backgrounds from Black, from Asian, from minority ethnic groups, and obviously there are issues in itself with that term. But to make a real difference, we need to work earlier upstream. It's not good enough just sort of picking the people from the profession we already have. We've got to talk about the power and values of working within the whole built environment sector as a stage of education and well. And I hope that the white paper, if it's reinventing the planning system, is also an opportunity to reinvent the profession, and that this is seen as a project that will be, 5 to 10 years, and the government could set all local authorities a target, even the whole built environment industry, a target of being genuinely representative of the communities they serve, in the same way that we've got a zero carbon target, but hopefully slightly sooner than that, and really work as an industry to try and address this. Because until then, all of this talk about engaging communities will only be making up for a fundamental lack of kind of justice in the way that the built environment is structured.
Okay, I will leave it there because we're 2 minutes over. Hold my hands up. I did try to bring some diversity on the panel, and Finn did call me up on it, and I will admit it's not good enough. So I was really hoping the mayor of Newham was looking to join us, and she didn't manage it, as well as other people who've received invitations and no over the last few weeks. But anyway, hold my hand up. Not good enough. Really great to have you guys here. Thank you so much for participating. That's our first Parley. Thank you to the audience for your brilliant questions. We have a Miro board. You can post some challenges on there. And I am going to sign off. So see you in the social lounge. See you at our next session. And thank you very much.